friends, in the series which we are doing on history of India from 1700 to 1950 in the earlier lecture on commercialization of agriculture, we talked about that how British they engaged in commercialization of agriculture in India and how some of the crops they were being grown for the commercial purposes. And in the context of the industrial revolution in England, the kind of changes which came and how the British they needed the raw materials for the British industries in India, and many of the crops they were being grown in India so that they could be sent to Britain. And it was also in the framework of the kind of changes which were happening in the international level, whether the French Revolution or the Napoleon continental blockade or the American Civil War, where the revolt of slaves could be seen. So how the cultivation of indigo in the case of French, or cotton in the framework of the American Civil War, and the Taipei Rebellion in China in the framework where the export of tea from China to Britain was impacted, and how British we find that they wanted to grow, or rather they grew all these kinds of crops in India, that indigo for that matter, or for that matter how opium or tea was also grown in India. And they wanted that when tea was being grown in India, tea could be exported to China, and the balance of trade thing which was there in the context of China could be maintained. They did not have to send bullion to China because they were sending the opium from India. Then we also see that it could also be seen in the case of jute as well, that how jute was also grown in the eastern part of Bengal. And we find that the prices of jute they were very high, and some of the areas they grew in prosperity during this particular period. And we find that some of the peasants they in a way extended cultivation on their own accord, but they took advances from the moneylenders, and it led to some kind of a coercion during that point of time. And this coercion was there with regard to every crop which was being grown in the context of the cash crops, as the revenue demand was always very high, and when the advances they were being given by the merchants and others, or the British gumastas to these agriculturalists, then they in a way fell into some kind of a debt trap, out of which it was very difficult to come, and the prices which were being fixed in terms of purchase by these moneylenders or the British agents, they were very low, because of which we find that all the profits they were being in a way eaten away by these middlemen. We also see, apart from the other crops which we have already discussed, sugarcane was another one where the cultivation increased during the course of the 19th century due to the developments of the new markets, and also because of the home demand as well. And we see that how demand was increasing in Britain, and the supply from the West Indies they fell sharply after the revolt of slaves who provided labour force. And between 1835-36 and 1845-46, the export of the sugar it increased by 836%. So we find that how the British they also required another important crop which was sugarcane, and how the supplies when they were affected, British found some kind of alternative plans so that their demands it could be met. And we also see that sugarcane is one crop where the demand of the labor is very high, and because of the high labor demand we find that it is seen in the planting, cutting and the crushing of the crop. And scholars like Whitcomb they have studied sugarcane in this particular perspective in the context of the colonial India, and they have talked about that this long period it explains the predicament of the peasants. They had to take advances from the landlords and moneylenders and had to sell produce to the agents below the market price. So we find that because of the high labor input, we find that the crop is also takes a lot of time in terms of various practices or various processes in which we find that the crop is involved. And the peasants they were taking a lot of the loan from the moneylenders and others, and when they had to pay those loans, then it became some sort of a problem for them. We also see that mulberry was another crop which was cultivated particularly in Bengal, and it was concerned with the silk industry. It was a flourishing area. in Bengal, but ever since the British, they got control over Bengal and destroyed the indigenous industries, production and export of raw silk was encouraged, which increased during Napoleon's continental blockade as well. So we find that when British, they were in a way ruling India, when they were able to control Bengal, the big province, we find that none of the indigenous industries, they could survive because of the policies of the British. And the production and the export of the raw silk was encouraged by the British because they did not want that the finished products, they should be made in India. Rather, they wanted the raw material for their own industries. We also see, apart from these crops, the cotton was another crop where the production of the cotton shows the free peasant commercialization, that is, the no element of non-economic coercion was present. And it became important under the stimulus of the foreign demand engineered by the cotton boom, especially during the American Civil War, which was in 1860s, and by opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. And the commercialization of cotton was linked in a way peasantry with the world market. So we find that when cotton was being grown in India, and how it was also important from the framework of the foreign demand, because we find that the cotton boom, it emerged during the American Civil War, and it was one crop which was needed for the textile industry. And how the Indian farmers, they got linked with the world markets in that way. And we find that because of the kind of attraction of some kind of higher prices for their products, many of the cultivators, they in a way showed some kind of initiative in terms of indulging in the cultivation for the market. But we also see, Sunil Sen has argued that this increase in the export did not help lower the strata of peasantry, as the advances from the moneylenders indebted them and sold produce at low prices. So we find that this kind of a price fluctuation, it discouraged the peasant. So we find that despite that some of the peasants, they started the cultivation of the crop on their own accord, it does not mean that they were the beneficiaries in the long run, even if they benefited in the initial period. We find that in the long run they were in a way being forced by the government to produce the kind of crops which were being grown by them as cash crops. And because of the price fluctuations, we also see that peasants, they were also affected. And when you tend to see it within the framework of the mother country, we find that how the economic interests of the mother country, they were being served, and how the Indian peasantry got adversely affected because of this. And some of the scholars, they have also talked about that if you see the overall impact of commercialization of agriculture, then it was not very great, it was very little, because a small proportion of the total cultivable land was being used for the commercialization of agriculture. And they have argued in terms of data that as late as 1891-92, only 27.9 million hectares of land out of 160 million hectares, that only 16.5% of land was under commercial production. And we also see that even if when you try to see it in the framework of the land which was being used for commercialization of agriculture, or when you talk about that only a section of the peasantry got affected because of commercialization, how they were being exploited, it does not mean that the policies were correct, or even if its impact was on even a very small section, even then they suffered for nothing in that sense. And we also see that how the commutation of produce in cash also proved disastrous for the peasants, because they had to sell the produce during the harvest time when the prices were very low, and the poorer ones brought back, they had to bought or purchase back a part of produce at high prices, which ruined the peasants as well. And we find that the Indian peasant was repeatedly made to bear the burden of widely fluctuating prices in terms of the international market. And at the same time, the Indian peasant did not have much bargaining power in that sense, because they had taken loan from the merchants and money lenders, etc., and they had to repay their loans. So they had to sell their produce at the time of the harvest when the prices of the product or their crop was low. And when the prices increased, many times they also had to indulge in purchasing that product at a higher price. So we find that this kind of a system of advances, it affected the credit organization as well. And at the same time, we see that it strengthened the institution of the money lenders, as commercial crops usually required higher inputs and more advances. And how the Mahajans, when they provided the advances, they established control over the production. So such a kind of a coercion by the money lenders, which could also be, which has been recorded in that sense in various records, and at the same time we have also seen that how people in different areas, they also revolted against the money lenders, and they burnt the records of these money lenders, because the way their records, they were being maintained by the money lenders, they increased their interest time and again, and if they took debt for one time, then they never came out of the debt cycle in that sense. And it was also not only written in the literature of the early part of the 20th century, but we also see that it was also shown in many of the films, where how the money lenders and the Sarkar and the Sahukar and Zamindar, all of them, they were some sort of a kind of a trio which was exploiting the peasants. And we find that B.B. Chaudhary has argued that in many cases it was not the traditional money lenders, but a new credit agency consisting of the European planters or traders, etc., who gave the advances. And S. Bhattacharya has also argued that British planters, they used a system of coercion in order to keep the peasants stuck to land. So scholars like Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, B.B. Chaudhary, all of them, they have also in a way argued that coercion was an important aspect in that sense, and even not only the traditional money lenders, as Chaudhary has argued, but a new credit agency of the Europeans was also involved in terms of the exploitation of the peasants. Then we also see that how the changeover to the commercial crops and the higher priced food grains, due to the revenue and the rent pressures, it meant a shift away from the poor person's food crops like jowar, bajra, etc., which caused disaster during the famine year. And we find that due to the low prices and high taxation, the productive investment or innovation remained a very risky business. And when one is talking about and one is trying to analyze the commercialization of agriculture, and how commercialization of agriculture was an important component of the colonialist policy, and so scholars, they have also tried to see whether it led to the development of the capitalist relations. And Harry Clever, he sees that the evolution of capitalist relations took place because of the commercialization of agriculture. And scholars like Madhurlal Mukherjee, they have seen it as an apparently semi-feudal form of surplus appropriation of rent in kind, and a remarkable increase in the degree of monetization as well. So whether commercialization of agriculture led to the development of the capitalist relations, so in that sense there are divergent opinions of the scholars in this regard, that some of them, they have seen it in the framework of the development of the capitalist relations, and others, they have tried to see in the framework of the semi-feudal form of surplus appropriation, as Madhurlal Mukherjee has done. And we also see that how, when you talk about the kind of development, then we find that it did not lead to any kind of eventual dissolution of the feudal relations and towards the proliferation of the capitalist relations. And other scholars like Amit Bhaduri and Hamza Alve, they talk about the coexistence of the feudal and capitalist mode of production both. And Naveed Hamid talks about the dynamism in the process of the development of the market relations and of agriculture, which resulted in the differentiation of peasantry. So we find that scholars, they have different kinds of ideas with regard to the capitalist relations, which could be seen at this point of time. And scholars like Sumit Sarkar, they have seen that how commercialization of agriculture did contribute to the differentiation within the peasantry, but hardly to the real growth except perhaps in certain pockets, and how the Indian peasant was made totally dependent on a very distant and unknown foreign market with which his only link was through a formidable chain of intermediaries. So we find that how Indian peasant was dependent on the foreign market, and how he was not directly connected to that particular foreign market, and a formidable chain of intermediaries it was there in that, and one of the sufferers was the Indian peasant. And we also see scholars and historians, they have also seen it in the framework of the losses which are suffered by the cultivators in the growing jute during the years of depression and after, and we find that eroded the base of existence for the majority of the peasants as well. And even if some peasants, they were able to collect some kind of funds, they did not have intense incentive to turn towards the trade. And if they found some kind of an incentive to turn towards the trade, usury, usury, or renting out of land to subtenants or sharecroppers. So in that way, they were in a way parasitically shifting the whole burden of production risks instead of going in for real capitalist farming. So they were not in a way investing their money by cultivating themselves. Rather, they in a way got into other kinds of activities with the kind of profits which they earned from the commercialization of agriculture. Then we also see that how when it is talking about the kind of changes which came in the positive frame of mind, that how it led to prosperity in the certain areas and the accumulation of wealth to the actual producers. And we find that this type of agriculture also went with the improved communications as well, and the possibilities of local scarcities in a way escalating into famines, they were being reduced. In that sense, it has also been talked about, and the commercial circuit was in a way internationalized. So these kinds of some of the positive aspects have been talked about, and it also led to regional specialization in the growth of markets as well. And historians, they have also talked about whether it was a forced process or not, and B.B. Chaudhary says that it was a partially forced process. And during the boom period, a number of peasants, they engaged increased, and we find that showing they were attracted by the expectations of higher returns. So Chaudhary has argued from this particular perspective, and Asiya Siddiqui has talked about that it was not really a forced process. It did not benefit the primary producers in the boom period in northern India, and all the benefits were not appropriated by the creditors themselves. So scholars, they have different kinds of opinions with regard to commercialization of agriculture, that whether it was being forced upon the farmers or they voluntarily in a way wanted to engage in it. But we find that definitely the way scholars, they have tried to study commercialization of agriculture in different regions and of different crops, we find that they expected some kind of higher returns which they did not get in the long run. And even if they voluntarily engage themselves in the context of the production of these crops, it does not mean that they were not in a way exploited in the long run. And we find that scholars, when they have talked about it, they see that the poor peasants, they saw it as some kind of a forced process because they needed money to meet the growing burden of the revenue and rent in cash. They had to pay the land revenue and rent in cash. So they had to go for commercialization of agriculture, because unless they will go for the commercialization of agriculture, they will not be able to get the money or the cash with them. And the British, they demanded the rent or revenue in cash, so which became some sort of a burden for them. And to in a way meet this kind of a demand by the British, it was imperative on them that they sell the crops as soon as it is being harvested, even if at a very lower price, because once they will get the cash, then they will be able to meet the demand of the revenue in cash. And we find that the kind of surveys, the kind of records which were being created by talking to peasants about this, that Coimbatore peasants, they say that by growing each crop, they now went half fed. They were not able to feed their stomach fully, but at least they had money with which to meet the revenue demand, and that was an important concern. And scholars, they have in a way seen that if you try to understand the commercialization of agriculture, that the point in this context was not that how many peasants they suffered during this time. As Sumit Sarkar has also seen, that they suffered for nothing. So commercialization of agriculture is to be seen in this particular kind of a context, and how the Indian scholars, they have tried to see this particular kind of a phenomena is an important concern. And one has to also see that commercialization of agriculture was also in a way linked to the British demand, in that sense that how the British industries, they are going in a way to feed themselves in the context of the raw materials which were required by them. And in the context of the international developments, as we've also talked about, that how the international influence, they played an important role at that point of time in the context of the various crops which were being grown because of a lot of international influence. And as we have seen that the colonial policy which was followed by the British in the context of the various revenue settlements, in the context of the expansion and the consolidation of its empire, whether in the framework of the drain of wealth. So commercialization of agriculture was no exception, because here also we find that British, they were concerned with themselves, and the way the kind of greed which was there in them could also be seen in this particular kind of a context. And British, they did not only oppress or suppress the Indians in the context of the commercialization of agriculture, but this kind of policy could be seen entirely in the British rule in India, whether it was ruling on behalf of the East India Company, for that matter, in the initial half, for example till 1857, or when the British Crown assumes power in 1858. So commercialization of agriculture, in that sense, we find that it was the result of the colonial policy, and at the same time we find that this kind of a process, which could be seen as some sort of a forced process, where peasants, they were being forced to grow those crops, and not only the merchants or the moneylenders, but at the same time a credit agency of the apparatus which was being created by the British at that point of time, which was responsible for the exploitation of the peasants. And we find that the peasants at that point of time, they were not only being harassed by the Trayaka of the Sarkar, Sahukar and Zamindar, but at the same time this kind of an exploitation continued because of the judiciary as well, because the apparatus where they could seek any kind of remedy for themselves was not even available to them, because judiciary itself was in a way required a lot of money for the peasants, so that they could in a way approach judiciary, which was again with the people, those who had money. So all these kinds of factors in a way led to the commercialization of agriculture. And in the context of the impact of the commercialization, we find that how the Indian peasantry was worst hit because of this kind of a measure, which was within the framework of the larger design of the colonial policies. So with this, I'd like to end the discussion. Thank you very much.